Hi, my name is Nora, and I'm 30 years old. If you had asked me a few years ago how it felt to grow up in a wealthy American family, I might have told you I was lucky, privileged, protected. But today, I know better. I wasn't lucky. I was invisible. From the outside, everything looked perfect. We lived in a grand colonial estate in Connecticut, surrounded by manicured lawns, private tennis courts, and the kind of silence that only money can buy. My parents, Thomas and Susan, ran our lives like a perfectly scheduled business, cold, efficient, and all about appearances. But inside that polished world, I learned quickly, I was never going to be their favorite. That place belonged to my younger sister Mia. Mia was 3 years younger than me, but somehow always managed to be 3 steps ahead, at least in our parents' eyes. She was the golden girl. Every dance recital, every A grade, every social event, she was their pride. I remember once winning a national essay competition in high school, an achievement that made it to the regional newspapers. My mom barely looked up from her phone. "That's nice, sweetheart," she said. "But please keep your voice down. Mia's practicing her violin." By the time I turned 18, I had already stopped trying. I didn't shout for attention. I didn't rebel. I simply disappeared quietly into the background, choosing a life of purpose over praise. I studied social development, graduated top of my class, and began working with nonprofits that focused on underserved communities, building women's training centers, running awareness campaigns, and supporting education in forgotten neighborhoods. But even then, my parents never asked questions about my work. If it didn't involve corporate meetings, quarterly earnings, or stock options, it simply didn't exist in their world. Only one person ever noticed me: my grandmother, Margaret. She was the matriarch of our family. Elegant, sharp, and surprisingly warm when no one else was watching. While my parents played perfect on the outside, my grandmother had built the Wilson legacy from grit and instinct. She'd once run 3 businesses before turning 40. I don't know what she saw in me, but whenever we were alone, she'd say, "You have more substance than anyone in this house, Nora. They just don't have the eyes to see it." Her words carried me through years of quiet heartbreak. Then one spring morning, everything changed. I received a formal letter, not a phone call, not a text, a printed, embossed envelope. The kind of invitation reserved for weddings or political galas. It was from Grandmother Margaret, inviting the entire family to a special weekend gathering at the Wilson estate in New Hampshire. The reason? A private family financial update. As I held the letter in my hands, my stomach twisted. I had no idea what was coming, but a voice inside me whispered, "This isn't just another family visit." It was the beginning of something I never saw coming. The Wilson estate in New Hampshire looked exactly as I remembered: massive, imposing, and utterly silent except for the sound of gravel crunching beneath my tires. It had always reminded me of a castle where everyone was either pretending to be royalty or quietly hiding their wounds. As I stepped out of the car, Barbara, my aunt, greeted me with a warm hug. She was one of the few people in the family who didn't treat me like I was made of glass or just barely worth noticing. Inside, the house buzzed with excitement. At first, I thought it was about Grandmother Margaret's financial update. But then I saw the ballroom-style dining area, decked in gold and rose-colored decorations, champagne flowing, and a custom-made ice sculpture at the center of the hall shaped like 2 interlocking rings. Mia's engagement party. No one had mentioned it in the invitation. I spotted my sister across the room. She wore a floor-length satin gown in champagne gold. Her fiancé stood next to her, some finance guy from New York with a perfect smile and a handshake like a wet napkin. Before I could even ask questions, my parents approached. My mother, Susan, leaned in for a kiss on the cheek that barely touched skin. "You made it," she said with a tight smile. "How was the drive?" "Fine," I replied. I didn't realize this weekend was about Mia's engagement. "Oh, well, it's a mix of things," my father, Thomas, added vaguely. "But this felt like a good time to celebrate family." Family, I thought, looking around at the crowd of people who barely remembered my name. At dinner, Mia and her fiancé sat at the head table with our parents. I was seated between Kevin, my cousin who only ever talked about golf, and a family friend who kept calling me Laura. But the real slap came halfway through the evening. The lights dimmed, and a server brought out a sleek blue envelope on a silver tray. My father stood up, adjusted his cufflinks, and said into the mic, "Tonight isn't just about Mia's future as a wife. It's about her future as a Wilson." He turned toward her and opened the envelope with flair. "As a token of our pride and belief in you, your mother and I are gifting you $10 million to support your future, your dreams, and your role in our family legacy." Gasps and applause filled the room. Mia looked shocked, maybe even genuinely touched, as she hugged both our parents. The cameras flashed. Champagne poured. And I sat there, clapping, smiling politely, knowing this was just another version of what I'd seen my whole life. They never saw me. Not really. I didn't envy the money. What I envied was being chosen. As the clapping died down, I caught a glimpse of Grandmother Margaret from across the room. She wasn't clapping. She was simply watching me, her sharp eyes narrowing, not with pity, but with quiet understanding. And that one look told me something else was coming. That night, the estate felt heavier than usual. The marble halls echoed with the sounds of laughter, clinking glasses, and Mia's over-rehearsed giggles. I needed air. I slipped out through the back hall and wandered into the quiet garden, the same one I used to hide in during childhood parties when the pressure to smile got too much. The sky above was a deep navy, stars scattered like tiny hopes I couldn't quite reach. But just as I rounded the hedge near the west corridor, I heard voices. Familiar ones. I paused. It was my parents and Mia. They stood just inside the library, the door left slightly ajar. Their voices were low, but I could hear enough. "She looked so awkward during the announcement," Susan said with a chuckle. I almost felt sorry for her. Almost. "Nora's used to being in the background," Thomas replied. "She made her choice, nonprofits, activism, whatever that is. She shouldn't expect to benefit from the Wilson estate like Mia." "Do you think Grandma will actually include her in anything?" Mia asked. "Doubt it," my father said confidently. "Margaret is practical. She knows Mia is the future of this family. Nora, she's just emotional baggage." My stomach tightened. I wasn't surprised, but hearing it confirmed, so casually, so cruelly, still stung in a place I thought I'd long numbed. "Besides," Susan added, "we've given Nora plenty, tuition, rent money, when she was starting out. We've done more than enough." "It's time Mia gets what she deserves," Thomas said. "The estate, the company, it should all go to her. That's how we'll secure the legacy." Silence fell for a second before Mia asked quietly, "What if Grandma doesn't agree?" My father scoffed. "Then we'll convince her. Or go around her. Legally, we'll find a way." I backed away before I could hear more. My legs moved on their own, carrying me toward the guest wing like a ghost. Back in my room, I closed the door slowly, breathing hard. Not because their words were shocking, but because I suddenly realized they didn't just ignore me. They had erased me. I sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the suitcase in the corner. What was I even doing here? But before I could spiral further, my phone buzzed. It was a message from Grandmother Margaret's assistant, Hannah. "Good evening, Ms. Nora. Your grandmother would like all family members in the library tomorrow morning at 10 sharp. It concerns her estate. Attendance is mandatory." I put the phone down slowly. Mandatory. Something told me tomorrow would change everything. The next morning, sunlight spilled across the polished marble floors of the Wilson estate, but nothing could warm the chill in my chest. I dressed carefully, a dark emerald blouse and pressed black trousers. Simple, sharp, respectful. Not to impress them, just to remind myself who I was. At exactly 10 a.m., I walked into the library. It was one of the most intimidating rooms in the estate, lined wall-to-wall with leather-bound books no one ever read and portraits of ancestors whose eyes always seemed to judge. A long semicircle of chairs had been arranged, facing the massive walnut desk that once belonged to my late grandfather. But today, at the center, sat Grandmother Margaret, upright in her wheelchair, wrapped in a burgundy shawl, her expression unreadable. Beside her stood Martin Hayes, her longtime attorney, organizing a stack of formal documents. My parents sat confidently near the front. Mia, glowing with post-celebration confidence, sat between them, one manicured hand wrapped around a designer pen. I slid into a seat off to the side, close to Aunt Barbara and Cousin Kevin. Martin cleared his throat. Thank you all for coming. At Mrs. Margaret Wilson's request, we are gathered here today for a private disclosure regarding her estate planning. Before we begin, she is asked to address the family directly. All eyes turned toward Grandmother Margaret. She moved slowly, but with clear intention as she pressed her palms to the arms of her wheelchair and rose, standing on her own. Gasps rippled through the room. I may be old, she said, voice firm despite her frailty, but I am far from done. She looked directly at my father. Thomas, sit down. You've had your say for years. Now it's my turn. My father froze in place. He didn't speak. Then she turned to the rest of the family. I have watched this family become more obsessed with status than substance. Appearances over principles. And I will not let that be my legacy. Her gaze swept across the room until it landed on me. Nora, please stand. My heart thudded in my chest as I rose slowly, unsure of what was coming. She reached into the side table drawer and pulled out a white envelope. This is for you. I stepped forward and took it with trembling hands. When I opened it, I couldn't breathe. A check, made out in my name, for $70 million. I heard Mia suck in a breath. My mother whispered something sharp. My father just stared, frozen. That's not all, Grandmother said. Martin? He stepped forward. In accordance with Mrs. Wilson's directives, Nora is not only receiving a personal gift, but is also being named sole trustee of the entire Wilson estate, including business holdings, property assets, and voting control across all corporate branches. Mia jumped up. What? This is ridiculous. She's never even been in the business. My father stood now, too. Mother, this is a mistake. You can't hand the company to someone who's never. I can, Grandmother cut in, and I have. Because this estate is not a trophy. It's a responsibility. One that Nora has earned through integrity, service, and quiet strength. Traits this family has forgotten. I was frozen. Was this really happening? I looked around the room. Everyone's faces had cracked. Mine had never been clearer. The room felt like it had lost oxygen. Mia's jaw was clenched so tightly, her lip trembled. My mother's hands fidgeted with her pearl necklace, something she only did when trying to hide panic. My father stood tall but stunned, as if someone had pulled the ground out from under him, and he hadn't decided whether to shout or retreat. I held the check in my hands. Not because of the amount, but because of what it meant. For the first time in my life, someone in this family saw me not as an afterthought, but as someone worthy of trust. Martin Hayes calmly continued, The estate documents are signed, witnessed, and legally binding. Margaret Wilson has passed all medical evaluations and soundness of mind certifications. Any contestation of the trust will activate a clause that removes the challenger from any further inheritance or family holdings. Is this a punishment? My father snapped, his voice rising. Because I modernized the company? Because I didn't run it like it was 1985. No, Grandmother Margaret replied, her voice steady. This is about character. About who deserves to guide the future. Not for profit, but for purpose. She turned toward Mia. You've spent years taking shortcuts, claiming credit for your colleagues' work, manipulating board members. Did you really think I would know? That I wouldn't see? Mia's face went pale. I built this company, Margaret continued, brick by brick. And I will not hand it to someone who thinks a last name and a polished LinkedIn profile are all that matter. But Nora, Mia tried to argue, her voice breaking. She draws up community posters. She runs little charity meetings. That's not business. Grandmother's eyes flashed. Nora has done more for people than this family has in decades. While you climbed ladders, she built them for others to climb. The words hit like lightning. Mia flinched. My mother finally stood. Susan, Margaret said without being asked, Don't. You've spent your life decorating invitations and polishing images. This isn't your moment. Silence. Thick, undeniable. Then Margaret looked at me again, her voice gentler. You can decline it, of course. If you do, the estate will go to charity. But I hope you won't. I believe in you, Nora. I always have. I looked at her, at everyone, at the people who had ignored me, laughed at my choices, reduced my worth to numbers on a spreadsheet. And then I said, clear and steady, I accept. Mia let out a sound between a scoff and a gasp. My father turned and stormed out of the room, the sound of the heavy oak doors slamming behind him. My mother followed, silent and pale. Only Aunt Barbara and Cousin Kevin remained seated, stunned but quiet. Grandmother Margaret finally sat back down, her eyes proud but tired. Now, she said to Martin, let's discuss the transition. It's time this family remembered what real leadership looks like. And for the first time in my life, I was ready to lead. The next few weeks passed in a blur. I moved back into the Boston townhouse that I had nearly given up when grant funding for my nonprofit work dried out. Only this time, I wasn't returning as a struggling project manager. I was stepping into the role of trustee for the entire Wilson estate. But let me be clear, this wasn't some magical makeover. No one handed me a crown and stepped aside. From the very beginning, I faced resistance at every level. Board members questioned my qualifications. Investors tried to meet with Mia behind my back. Emails were forwarded, meetings delayed, documents mysteriously lost. But Grandmother Margaret had prepared for this. She had already identified trusted executives with clean records and solid ethics, men and women who had once been overlooked or silenced by my father and sister. With Martin Hayes as legal advisor, I began forming my own internal team. Quietly, strategically. Within 4 months, the results began to show. One of my first major decisions was to formally launch the Wilson Center for Women's Empowerment, an organization dedicated to uplifting women through education, job training, and microfunding initiatives. The very cause I had spent my 20s fighting for now had the backing of one of the country's largest family foundations. I still remember the ribbon-cutting day. A community college graduate named Anna hugged me with tears in her eyes after receiving her grant. You don't know what this means, she whispered. Actually, I said, I do. Back at headquarters, the shifts were impossible to ignore. My father, Thomas, had no choice but to accept a non-decision-making advisory role. He hated it, but the bylaws were rewritten. Every major choice required ethical oversight. My mother, Susan, quietly stepped away from board meetings. She stayed busy hosting events, staying visible on social platforms, but the power she once held in silence was gone. Mia, however, did not go quietly. 3 weeks after the transition, she resigned from the company in a dramatic email blast calling the restructure a betrayal of legacy. She launched her own startup, backed by private investors who still believed in her fast-talking brilliance. But without the Wilson name, the resources, or the protection of her usual enablers, the cracks appeared fast. By month 4, she reached out, not to apologize, but to negotiate her return. We met in a quiet conference room. No cameras, no public statements, just 2 sisters, one still angry, the other no longer afraid. You're enjoying this, Mia said bitterly. Having me at your mercy. No, I replied calmly. I'm trying to rebuild something better. If you want to be a part of that, you'll have to earn your place. That conversation changed everything. And so did I. Taking over the Wilson estate wasn't just about managing assets, it was about redefining what legacy meant. The old model thrived on image, speed, and exclusivity. Mine would be rooted in integrity, purpose, and impact. I began by restructuring internal leadership. With Martin Hayes by my side, we quietly replaced key department heads with people who had spotless records and deep community ties. I created an ethics oversight committee, something unheard of in our family's history, and required every new project to pass through social responsibility assessments. Some board members pushed back, subtly at first, then more openly. But they were met with data, rising employee satisfaction, investor confidence, and for those who still only believed in numbers, a slow, steady increase in revenue. Still, the personal side wasn't as easy. My father barely spoke to me. When he did, it was through dry emails about strategic reviews or stakeholder obligations. But I noticed the tone of his messages began to shift after our third quarterly meeting, where my ethical policy integration surprisingly improved long-term market projections. My mother, meanwhile, chose her battles differently. She attended our press events in carefully coordinated outfits, smiling for the cameras, but rarely addressed me directly. It was as if she didn't know whether to be embarrassed or envious. And Mia, well, she surprised me the most. After her failed startup attempt, she returned under the new ethical structure. Reluctantly at first. I gave her a role in market analysis, a position with no shortcuts and no space for manipulation. Her work was scrutinized like anyone else's. And to her credit, she delivered. One afternoon, after a successful pitch meeting for a women-led housing initiative, she lingered behind. "That was good," she said, almost like it hurt her to admit it. "It was your analysis that helped us secure the deal," I replied. She blinked. "You're actually giving me credit? You earned it." The silence that followed was heavier than any insult she'd thrown in the past. Because it wasn't sarcastic. It wasn't bitter. It was real. That was the beginning of a slow, tentative rebuilding. Aunt Barbara, always the quiet observer, became one of my greatest allies. "You're doing it right," she told me one evening after a board meeting. "For the first time in years, I'm proud to be a Wilson again." Cousin Kevin stopped trying to explain golf analogies in business strategy meetings and started helping organize outreach programs for the Wilson Center. Turns out he had a hidden talent for logistics. No, it wasn't perfect, but it was progress. The Wilson name was starting to mean something different, something better. And I was finally at peace with the fact that I didn't inherit it, I built it. The grand opening of our first Wilson Center for Women's Empowerment campus in downtown Boston was more than just an event. It was a statement. One that said, "We've changed, and we're not going back." The new campus was built on the site of an old textile factory, abandoned for decades. Now, it had been transformed into a vibrant, sunlit space filled with classrooms, childcare centers, wellness lounges, and training labs. It wasn't just beautiful, it was accessible, safe, and alive with potential. The guest list was diverse: local women's organizations, elected officials, media outlets, former beneficiaries, investors, and longtime family associates who were still adjusting to the new Wilson era. I stood by the entrance in a deep navy dress and my late grandmother's pearls, the same ones she had given me on the day I accepted the estate. As I greeted guests, I spotted Grandmother Margaret in her wheelchair near the front row, her nurse beside her. Her health had declined in the past month, but her eyes were as alert as ever. She looked at me and smiled. Proud, peaceful, present. When it was time for speeches, I stepped up to the podium, the microphone cool against my fingertips. 6 months ago, I began. I never imagined standing here. I thought I had a clear idea of where my life was headed, and then everything changed. But here's the truth. Sometimes life's greatest gifts arrive disguised as challenges. And sometimes a legacy isn't something you inherit. It's something you fight for, something you build. I spoke about the mission, the women we were serving, the purpose we now stood for, not just as a business, but as a family with new values. We no longer measure success only in numbers, I said. We measure it in lives changed, in barriers broken, in dignity restored. I closed with a simple quote my grandmother once told me. Wealth means nothing if it doesn't lift someone else. The crowd applauded, many standing to their feet. As I stepped down, Margaret reached out and squeezed my hand. You've exceeded every expectation, she whispered. I had excellent guidance, I replied. And your own light, she added. Don't forget that part. After the ceremony, I found myself face to face with my parents near the refreshments table. My father spoke first. Quarterly projections look strong, he said awkwardly. Board was impressed with your report. Coming from him, That was practically a standing ovation. My mother nodded. "Everything looks lovely," she said, her tone unusually soft. "You've done well, Nora." I didn't push for more. I didn't need to. Their presence today, however restrained, was enough. For now. And perhaps that was the start of healing. Later that evening, the celebration quieted. Guests left, the media packed up, and the campus lights dimmed to a gentle glow. I found myself standing on the rooftop garden alone, watching the city lights shimmer across Boston Harbor. It was surreal. 6 months ago, I was invisible. Dismissed. The forgotten daughter. Now, I was carrying an entire legacy on my shoulders, but it didn't feel heavy. It felt earned. Behind me, the elevator doors opened with a soft chime. Grandmother Margaret's nurse wheeled her out onto the rooftop, wrapped in a thick shawl. She motioned for the nurse to wait by the entrance. I walked toward her and knelt beside the chair, her hand already reaching for mine. "It's beautiful," she said, glancing over the city. "And so are you." I smiled through a swell in my chest. "You did all of this, Grandma. You believed in me when no one else did." "No," she replied softly. "I recognized you. There's a difference." She looked down for a moment, her voice more reflective. "You see, I built this empire with everything I had. But somewhere along the way, our family forgot why it mattered. Your parents became obsessed with prestige. Mia with winning. And I watched it all from a front row seat, wondering if anyone would see what truly matters again." She turned her gaze back to me. "Then there was you, always in the corner, always listening, always choosing the right thing, even when no one rewarded you for it." "I just wanted to make you proud," I whispered. She squeezed my hand. "You already have. But more importantly, are you proud of yourself?" The question stunned me. I had spent my whole life chasing validation from people who refused to offer it. And here she was, asking me to look inward. I paused, then nodded slowly. "Yes," I said. "For the first time in my life, I truly am." Her face lit up with that soft, rare smile, the one she used only for truth. "Then my job is done." The wind brushed lightly across the rooftop. I stood and leaned against the stone railing, watching the city move far below. A notification buzzed on my phone. It was from Logan, the community center director I'd worked with over the last few months. Our relationship had started out professional, but recently, there'd been a shift. "Logan, great speech today. Dinner later? Just us. No donor meetings. Just a toast to new beginnings." I smiled, soft, genuine, and free. Maybe the future didn't just belong to legacy and duty. Maybe there was room for something more. Something human. Something whole. I replied to Logan's message with a simple, "I'd love that." It felt good to say yes to something light. Something that didn't carry the weight of a family name, a business restructure, or a $1 million decision. Just one person choosing another, with no agenda. Later that week, I visited the Wilson Foundation headquarters, now fully renovated, with women of all ages moving through the space with purpose, applying for training, attending workshops, building small businesses. Real progress. Real lives changing. In the conference room, I led a session with our new ethics board, outlining plans for an international apprenticeship program that would send young women abroad to train in sustainable development and leadership. I watched the faces around me nod, people who believed in what we were doing, not just tolerated it. That afternoon, I returned to the estate one last time to meet with Grandmother Margaret. Her health had become more fragile, but her mind was still sharp, her spirit steady. "You've done more in 6 months than most CEOs do in 6 years, she said as I handed her the updated quarterly report. "It's a team effort," I replied. "No," she said firmly. "It's your integrity setting the tone. That's the difference." We sat in silence for a moment. Then she spoke again, her voice low. "Just remember, Nora, legacies aren't built overnight. But they can be destroyed overnight if you stop leading with purpose." I nodded. "I won't forget." "I know you won't. That's why we're here." As I left her room, something inside me felt settled. Not like a finish line, but like a foundation had been laid. Weeks later, as the seasons shifted and blossoms began appearing on the estate grounds, I stood on the same rooftop where Margaret and I had once looked over the city. This time, I wasn't alone. Logan stood beside me, his hand gently brushing mine. We weren't making declarations or promises. We were just present. And that was enough. As the sun set behind the skyline, casting long shadows across the garden, I thought about everything that had led to this moment. The neglect, the rejection, the betrayal, and then the recognition, the rebuilding, the choice. I used to think I needed their approval to feel whole. But the truth is, I only needed one person to see me clearly. And that person was me. The Wilson legacy had not been passed to me because I demanded it. It was entrusted to me because I had honored it, even when no one else did. And now I would carry it forward, not as a shadow of their dreams, but as the architect of my own. Thank you for listening to my story. If it resonated with you, or reminded you of your own journey of standing up for yourself, I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. Don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel for more powerful stories, and share it with someone who might need a reminder that real strength comes from within. New stories every week. See you next time.